The room was silent until the news broke, a sharp voice echoing through the crowded hall as the headline flashed across the giant screen. Ethan Carter felt his chest tighten when the anchor said, "The CEO has been ousted in a scandal that shakes the industry." His breath caught, his palms trembled, and he could feel hundreds of eyes burn into him like fire. He whispered to himself, "How did it come to this?" Cameras clicked like relentless hammers, their flashes piercing through his shame. Investors whispered, colleagues smirked, and his rival smirked with a cold satisfaction that cut deeper than the loss itself. The loyal confidant, Lucas, leaned close and muttered, "Don't say anything now, they want to see you break." Ethan's mind screamed with fury, but his voice drowned under the weight of humiliation. This was the moment he thought he had everything, yet it all collapsed before the world. Betrayal, doubt, and failure wrapped around him like chains, but somewhere deep within, a spark of defiance refused to die. The night air was cold as Ethan stumbled out of the building, cameras chasing him like predators hungry for blood. His tie hung loose, his eyes red with humiliation, and his breath carried the taste of defeat. Lucas followed, muttering, "Ignore them, Ethan, just keep walking." The rival's mocking smile replayed in his mind like a cruel echo, a reminder of the empire he had lost in a single evening. The reporters screamed questions, their words like knives. Was the scandal true? Did you fail your investors? Are you finished? He clenched his fists but said nothing, each step heavy, as though carrying the weight of the world. His thoughts spiraled. I was the dreamer, the one who believed. How did they turn so quickly? For the first time, doubt became louder than his own vision. Yet, in the silence between the chaos, he whispered a vow. I will rise again. At home, Ethan sat in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of city towers beyond his window. His phone buzzed endlessly, messages pouring in, half filled with pity, half with venom. His sister, Claire, called, her voice sharp with doubt. Ethan, maybe it's time to quit before you ruin yourself further. He closed his eyes, every word a stab to his chest. They want me to vanish, he thought, but quitting means they win. He remembered the first sketch of his dream, drawn years ago on the back of a napkin, and how it once set his soul on fire. Now, that fire flickered dangerously low. What if they were right, he whispered, his voice breaking. The silence of the apartment answered him, heavy, suffocating, until he clenched the napkin sketch again and muttered, "No, not yet." Morning light crept through half-closed blinds, but it offered no comfort. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee. The news blared from the television. Carter Corp collapses overnight. Investors demand answers. The words struck like repeated punches. His reflection in the black coffee showed a man he barely recognized. Broken, weary, stripped of confidence. Lucas entered, holding newspapers with headlines screaming betrayal and scandal. He said softly, "They've already chosen their villain, Ethan, and it's you." Ethan gritted his teeth, muttering, "Then I'll give them a story they won't forget." Though fear gnawed at his heart, anger flared with a dangerous intensity, a spark that might either consume him or forge his redemption. Later that day, Ethan walked through the empty office that once buzzed with ambition. Dust clung to the desks, monitors lay dark, and the walls echoed with silence. He touched the nameplate on his desk, fingers tracing the letters as if mourning a lost friend. "This was my empire," he whispered, his voice shaking. Memories flooded, laughter from his team, late nights chasing impossible dreams, moments of triumph now poisoned by betrayal. He paused by the empty chair of the partner who had walked away, the betrayer whose silence was louder than any confession. Lucas said from behind, "You built this from nothing. You can do it again." Ethan closed his eyes, tears threatening to fall, and replied, "If I rise, it won't be just to rebuild, it will be to prove them wrong." His words carried the first true spark of defiance since the fall. The garage smelled like metal dust and burned coffee, and the future looked like a whiteboard full of wild arrows. Ethan Carter said, "If we can stitch trust into data, we change everything." Lucas nodded, eyes fierce, sleeves rolled, and hope louder than doubt. They worked nights because rent was unforgiving and dreams were impatient. The fan rattled like a clock counting down to failure, yet Ethan grinned through the noise. He remembered the humiliation, but he fed it to the fire in his chest. Lucas said, "One clean demo and doors open." Ethan whispered, "One clean demo, and we breathe." Their laptops wheezed and the code broke, and they fixed it with stubborn love. In that cramped room, possibility felt bigger than the city outside. Ethan said, "This time we build it so no one can take it." The first prototype blinked to life like a shy heartbeat, and Ethan forgot to breathe. Priya Singh said, "Input secured. Anomaly flagged. That's real." Lucas laughed, a quiet burst that filled the room with courage. Ethan said, "No more gatekeepers, only proof." The monitor reflected in his tired eyes like sunrise after a storm. Failure hovered near the door. But today it waited outside. Priya said, "Edge cases will bite, but we can train past them." Ethan nodded, refusing to blink, and typed with careful hands. He felt the garage expand into a stadium, only they could hear. He said, "We name it Aegis because it shields what matters." They met Diana Park at a diner that smelled like maple and wisdom, the kind that sticks. Diana Park said, "Your idea is brave, your moat is thin, and your time is short." Ethan straightened, heat rising, but he listened like a student at the cliff edge. She traced a napkin with a triangle of focus, distribution, and proof. Diana said, "Pick 2 to start, or you will starve choosing 3. Lucas asked, "Where do we bleed least?" She smiled, flinty and kind, and circled proof. Ethan said, "We win trust with demonstrations no one can fake." Diana nodded. "Then show me a customer who cannot sleep without you." The diner light turned gold, and their plan hardened like cooling steel. Dinner at Claire's apartment carried the weight of family history and unspoken weather. Claire Carter said, "You are chasing a storm with a paper umbrella." Ethan forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said, "Paper becomes steel when you fold it right." She sighed, stacking bills and worries into neat piles only she could see. Claire said, "Mom asked if you have health insurance, and I did not know." Ethan felt the sting, and then the stubbornness, twin fires in one chest. He said, "I am building a future that pays for every sleepless night." Claire softened, not convinced but less afraid of the thunder. She murmured, "Just come home safe when it breaks." He nodded, and the silence felt like a truce. Samuel Reed's office was glass and gravity, and the city hung behind him like a verdict. Samuel Reed said, "Your tech is interesting, your traction is thin, and your runway evaporates." Ethan breathed slow, feeding fear into discipline. He said, "We secure data and make trust measurable, and one customer loses sleep without us." Lucas slid a brief case study across the table like a bridge. Reed tapped a page, expression unreadable, and asked for proof that could not be staged. Ethan said, "Give us 30 days and 1 pilot under your terms." The room held its breath while the city pulsed. Reed said, "Bring me proof, not poetry." Ethan nodded, already drafting tomorrow in his head. Night wrapped the pilot's site in humming servers and stale coffee, while dread worked the edges of courage. Ethan Carter said, "Aegis holds or we sink." Lucas Bennett answered, "We patch live and pray small." Priya Singh muttered, "Telemetry spiking, anomaly storm inbound." The dashboard pulsed red like a heartbeat losing rhythm, and the air grew thin with silence. Ethan said, "Throttle inputs, slice the traffic, keep the integrity engine honest." Fans roared, cables warmed, and the room felt smaller than their fear. Priya said, "Edge case cascade, I can triage 3 paths, pick one." Ethan pointed and chose the risky fix because time was already bleeding. Lucas said, "We will owe the morning a miracle." The clock crawled, the spike bent, and the graphs cooled like metal after forging. Ethan exhaled and whispered, "Not perfect but alive." He leaned back and felt shame fade a notch, replaced by a calm that tasted like resolve. Priya smiled and said, "Proof is noisy, but it is proof." Ethan nodded. "Tomorrow we harden everything." By noon the headlines arrived like arrows, and each one bore the same poisonous crest. Victor Hale said, "Security Theater," in a broadcast clip that looped on every feed. Ethan Carter stared at the screen while anger and fear tugged the same wire. Lucas Bennett said, "They are undercutting on price and selling doubt by the pound." A vendor email arrived with new terms that smelled like trapdoors and velvet. Ethan said, "They want us broke before we are believed." Claire Carter texted, "Please be careful, this looks bad," and duty ached in his ribs. Priya Singh said, "Their claims target the part we just reinforced." Ethan paced and said, "We will answer with proof, not noise." The team drafted a technical rebuttal with diagrams sharp enough to shave doubt. Lucas said, "Publish now and call Reed." Ethan hit send and felt the floor tilt. He whispered, "Hold the line, hold the line," while the city answered with a siren that sounded like warning in war. Bugs crept in from angles they had not mapped, and trust thinned like old rope. Mason Cole said, "I can refactor the ingest, give me the keys for a night." Ethan Carter hesitated, then said, "Be careful with the audit hooks." Lucas Bennett watched Mason smile, linger a beat too long, and filed the feeling under later. Priya Singh said, "Checksums disagree with history," and the air turned colder than the room. Mason waved a hand and said, "Phantom duplicates, I will patch." Ethan rubbed his temples and whispered, "We cannot afford paranoia." A client log appeared on a forum that was not supposed to know it existed. Lucas said, "This leak stinks of inside knowledge." Ethan breathed slow and answered, "We lock access now, and we look again when dawn is honest." The garage lights flickered like nerves, and ambition felt briefly like a storm with no shore. The conference room felt like a courtroom where the jury was the clock. Samuel Reed said, "Show me certainty under load." Ethan Carter nodded, palms damp, and launched the demo. The graph climbed smooth and then snagged on an uninvited spike like cloth on a nail. Victor Hale's team posted a live critique that fluttered across everyone's phones like gnats. Reed's eyes cooled a fraction, and the room cooled with them. Lucas Bennett said, "Failover engaged. Expected dip." The dip arrived, and so did the silence that follows bad news. Priya Singh whispered, "Bug traced to the vendor patch I can hot fix in 60. Ethan said, "Do it and rerun integrity." The second pass steadied, but the magic had already lost its first gasp. Reed closed his notebook and said, "You have potential, not proof." Ethan swallowed and answered, "We will return with proof you can't ignore." Bills stacked like uneasy towers, while courage thinned to a stripe. Claire Carter said, "You cannot keep burning on fumes," and the kitchen went very quiet. Ethan Carter answered, "If I stop now, the fall was for nothing." Lucas Bennett stared at the budget sheet and said, 3 weeks if no one blinks." Priya Singh texted, "I can defer my pay if it buys time," and loyalty hurt more than debt. Ethan whispered, "No, we protect the team even if it cracks me." The night carried a freight train of doubt through his ribs, and sleep refused to bargain. He replayed Victor's clip, Reed's sentence, Mason's smile, and the dip that felt like shame. He said, "Pain is the tax for building," and wrote a list titled Proof or Silence. At the bottom he added, "Guard what cannot be replaced," and underlined it twice like a prayer. The email subject line screamed betrayal louder than words could. Ethan Carter read the log files, heart hammering as the timestamps told a truth uglier than rumor. Mason Cole had siphoned data with a hidden key, and the proof glowed cold on his screen. Lucas Bennett stormed in and said, "Tell me it's a mistake." Ethan whispered, "He gutted us from inside." Priya Singh clenched her fists and muttered, "That leak wasn't phantom, it was planted." Rage coiled in Ethan's chest, but sorrow shadowed it heavier. Claire Carter called and said, "Why does the news say your partner sold the code?" Ethan could not answer her, not yet. He stared at Mason's name on the access log, each line burning like a scar. Ethan said, "The wound was friendly fire." His breath shook, but his voice steadied as he vowed, "This betrayal ends here." The confrontation cut sharper than knives, with Mason Cole smirking as if guilt were fashion. Ethan Carter said, "You sold us for scraps." Mason leaned back and replied, "I sold us for survival, and you still don't see the difference." Lucas Bennett slammed his hand on the table and barked, "You killed your own family." Mason shrugged, mask cracking just enough to show greed curdled into shame. Priya Singh said, "You never believed in us, you believed in shortcuts." Ethan's chest ached, but his voice hardened. "Leave now before I burn your bridges for you." Mason gathered his bag, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. Ethan stood taller, though his insides shook. He said, "You may have stolen code, but you'll never steal the fire that built it." Mason left, door slamming like thunder, and silence crawled into the room like smoke. News broke before dawn, spreading betrayal faster than any defense could. Headlines branded Ethan Carter reckless, investors whispered poison in quiet corridors, and Victor Hale smiled on camera saying, "Competence requires loyalty." Ethan gripped his coffee mug until it cracked in his hand. Lucas Bennett said, "They are feeding on Mason's story, not the truth." Claire Carter's call cut through static. "Ethan, they've made you the villain." Priya Singh said, "Every lie travels faster than code." Ethan stared out the window at a city that felt colder than glass, and muttered, "Then we make the truth undeniable." His voice trembled, but conviction pushed through like steel. Lucas nodded and said, "We fight louder." Ethan whispered to himself, "No more half measures." The betrayal had become spectacle, but so would their proof. The garage no longer felt like home. It felt like a battlefield scarred by absence. Ethan Carter laid out diagrams while Lucas Bennett said, "Every patch Mason touched must be rebuilt." Priya Singh said, "We harden with transparency or we drown." Ethan traced lines on the whiteboard, each stroke jagged with anger. He said, "They wanted to break us from within, but we will rebuild stronger and cleaner." Lucas muttered, "The world won't wait, Reed already doubts." Ethan's voice grew louder, "Then we make him regret doubting." Claire Carter arrived with sandwiches, her voice trembling. "You're chasing redemption on no sleep." Ethan touched her hand and said, "This isn't redemption, it's survival." Priya whispered, "No, Ethan, it's both." The room filled with the sound of keys, markers, and a fragile hope sewing itself back together. When Diana Park called them into the cafe, her eyes already knew the truth. She said, "The world thinks Mason broke you, so show them he didn't." Ethan Carter exhaled, shoulders heavy, and said, "Then we rebuild the proof in public." Lucas Bennett frowned. "That's exposure." Diana leaned closer, voice steady. "Exposure is the cure for poison." Priya Singh said, "If we open the architecture, Victor will try to exploit it." Ethan's jaw clenched, "Then we will outpace him." Diana slid a napkin across with 3 words, "Proof," out loud. Ethan traced the letters and whispered, "No shadows left to hide in." Claire Carter's voice echoed in his memory, "Come home safe." And for once safety meant fire, not retreat. Ethan stood and said, "Then we burn brighter than their lies." The campaign, called Proof Out Loud, began with a repo that glowed like a dare, and the timeline filled with strangers who turned into witnesses. Ethan Carter said, "We open the architecture and log every test in daylight." Priya Singh said, "Telemetry public, redactions minimal, integrity first." Lucas Bennett said, "We ship a reference client and a demo harness, no smoke." The first live stream stuttered, and Ethan laughed to blunt the fear that gnawed like a small storm. He said, "Failure is allowed, secrecy is not." Developers asked ruthless questions, and Priya answered like a surgeon who loved truth more than comfort. Claire Carter texted, "You look tired and alive," and he breathed deeper. Diana Park dropped in and typed, "Make the hard parts obvious." Ethan said, Then we narrate every edge case. The graph of trust moved by inches, not miles, but inches felt like sunrise. He whispered, "Let them watch us earn it," and hit go on another test. Diana Park turned a quiet studio into a crucible for stories that could carry weight across a hostile room. Diana Park said, "Pitch the wound before the cure, or they will not feel the risk." Ethan Carter said, "Breaches break revenue and faith. We sell recovered faith." She paced like a conductor and snapped, shorter lines, slower breath. Lucas Bennett said, "Integrity engine, verifiable proofs, portable across vendors." Diana held up a hand and said, "Translate that to pain a CFO counts." Priya Singh said, "Downtime to minutes, fraud to noise, audits to green." Diana smiled and said, "Now it lands." Ethan repeated the opening until it felt like his own heartbeat. She dimmed the lights and said, "Look them in the eyes when the price hurts." He nodded and whispered, "We are ready to be expensive and necessary." They needed more hands than hope, so they called the ones who believed before applause. Nora Kim said, "I kept the build scripts from the old days," and the room exhaled like a saved file. Ethan Carter said, "We watermark every module and automate proofs." Lucas Bennett said, "We add chaos tests that break friendly and hostile." Priya Singh said, "And publish failures before fixes to starve rumor." Alan West said, "I will draft licenses that punish theft without punishing adoption." Ethan nodded and said, "Guardrail law with open doors." Nora's quiet speed stitched gaps no one saw until they vanished. Claire Carter brought food and said, "Eat before you become smoke." Ethan smiled and said, "We will taste victory with this soup." The whiteboard filled with arrows that pointed somewhere that looked like morning. The dress rehearsal with Samuel Reed felt like standing on a cliff while the sea asked hard questions. Samuel Reed said, "Assume I want you to fail. Persuade me anyway." Ethan Carter said, "We quantify trust with proofs your auditors can replay." Reed said, "Show me price against risk." And Lucas Bennett slid a cost curve that rose slower than fear. Priya Singh said, "Latency adds 4 milliseconds on average and buys certainty under attack." Reed tapped the slide and said, "What happens when your vendor betrays you again?" Ethan answered, "We survive because our proofs survive us." Reed nodded once and said, "Better, but sharpen the ask." Diana Park whispered, "Close with the cost of doing nothing." Ethan said, "Silence is the most expensive breach," and the room finally let him breathe. The night before the pitch, the city hummed like a transformer, and the office answered with a steadier hum. Ethan Carter said, "Everything we say tomorrow must already be true tonight." Priya Singh said, "Final canary green. Proofs reproducible, logs mirrored offsite." Lucas Bennett said, "Demo path locked, rollback mapped, failure modes rehearsed." Claire Carter said, "Breathe between wins," and set a small photo of them at a fair beside his laptop. Diana Park said, "Sleep is a strategy," and he promised to try. He walked the aisles between desks that held more than circuits. They held wagers on a better future. He said, "We built the spine, now we show the heartbeat." Outside, thunder rolled distant, and he decided it sounded like applause they had not earned yet. He whispered, "Tomorrow we do." The auditorium thrummed like a living engine, and the lights felt as hot as the stakes. Ethan Carter said, "We came to prove what trust looks like." Samuel Reed watched with a calm that measured futures, not words. Lucas Bennett whispered, "Demo path clean, failovers armed." Priya Singh said, "Live telemetry on screen, no edits, no cuts." Diana Park stood at the back like a lighthouse that refused to blink. Ethan clicked into the opening, and the graphs rose steady, not heroic. He said, "Aegis signs every event and survives our absence." Reed said, "Numbers are honest when pain is counted." Ethan showed cost curves that bent slower than risk and breathed easier. Priya said, "Attack simulation in 30 seconds." Ethan nodded and added, "Truth is reproducible, even under fire." The attack arrived like a drumline from the dark, and phones lit with Victor Hale's taunting post. Victor Hale said, let's see this toy under real pressure. Priya Singh said, inbound flood with signature spoofing. Lucas Bennett said, route to chaos lane and keep proofs deterministic. The graph spiked, dipped, and threatened to shear, but the proof engine held its signature. Ethan Carter said, failures are visible because hiding them costs more. Reed leaned forward and murmured, prove it, survives bad faith. Priya triggered the forensic replay, and the audit trail stitched like steady stitches. Ethan said, every packet carries a witness, every witness survives tampering. The room exhaled as the spike curved into order, and then cooled. Diana Park whispered, now ask for the choice that matters. When the second wave hit, the room flinched, and a quiet voice chose not to. Nora Kim said, I can expose the watermark in real time. Ethan Carter nodded and said, do it and show the lineage map. Priya Singh said, publishing verifier to the crowd link now. Lucas Bennett said, watch for side channel noise. Nora typed fast, and the watermark bloomed like invisible ink finding daylight. Ethan said, every module declares its parents and its scars. The audience murmured as a stolen branch traced back to Mason's patch. Reed said, that is not theater. That is history. Diana Park smiled without moving and said, let them verify on their phones. Ethan breathed and added, proof belongs to everyone today. The second wave lost its teeth and turned into a case study. Victor Hale walked in with a smile that wanted to own the air, and the crowd split around him. Victor Hale said, partnership on my terms, or I bury you with discount. Ethan Carter said, we prefer daylight to discounts. Reed's eyebrow rose, weighing courage against math. Lucas Bennett said, we can replicate across vendors without lock-in. Priya Singh said, proofs outlast platforms including yours. Victor stepped closer and hissed, price is a weapon you cannot dodge. Ethan answered, integrity is a moat you cannot steal. Diana Park said, make the ask, Ethan. He turned to Reed and said, lead our round and mandate our verifier across your portfolio. Reed looked at the room, then at the graphs that would not lie, and the silence felt like a held note. Reed stood, and the room rose with him, because decisions sometimes arrive on 2 feet. Samuel Reed said, I will lead the round and require the verifier in portfolio audits. Victor Hale's smile thinned like old paint. Ethan Carter said, terms include open proofs and shared incident drills. Reed nodded and said, price holds if resilience holds. Priya Singh said, you can break us, but you cannot break the ledger. Lucas Bennett said, we welcome measured fire to keep us sharp. Victor muttered, enjoy your brief sun, and turned away. Diana Park said, the hard part begins now, and her eyes were kind and stern. Ethan looked at the team and said, we choose the honest hard road. The room answered with applause that sounded like rain on a new roof. Morning arrived with emails that sounded like doors unlocking. Ethan Carter said, roll the verifier to the full portfolio. Lucas Bennett answered, pipelines green across regions. Priya Singh said, proof caches primed, audits reproducible. Samuel Reed wrote, congratulations, now keep moving. Diana Park said, celebrate by shipping. Claire Carter sent a photo of the cracked mug glued back together. She wrote, not perfect, but stronger. Ethan smiled at the seams. He said, scars teach the shape of pressure. Nora Kim pushed a patch that removed a silent bottleneck. She said, small hinges swing big outcomes. Alan West finalized licenses that guarded openness without fear. He said, clarity is armor. Ethan stood by the window and watched the city breathe. He whispered, we were not saved by luck, we were saved by proof. The room felt new, and the future felt earned. By noon, a client screamed quietly into the hotline, and the past tried to return. Ethan Carter said, engage incident drill. Priya Singh said, fraud pattern emerging, signature mismatch detected. Lucas Bennett said, failed to defensive posture and preserve state. The graphs shivered and then settled as the ledger held. Samuel Reed messaged, your first real storm as partners. Diana Park said, speak clearly while you fix. Ethan narrated the steps to the client without drama or apology. He said, we see it, we contain it, we verify it. Priya announced, exposure minutes, not hours. Claire Carter texted, I heard the siren in your voice, then it stopped. Ethan exhaled and closed the loop with a short post-mortem. He said, trust increases when truth arrives fast. The client replied, we will renew early. Ethan stared at the screen and felt the weight lift. Evening gathered like a kind listener, and the team finally allowed silence to sit with them. Diana Park said, you stood inside the fire and described the shape. Ethan Carter said, you taught us to breathe between proofs. Lucas Bennett raised a paper cup and said, 2 inch by inch. Priya Singh laughed for the first time in weeks. She said, to edges, mapped and edges still unknown. Nora Kim said, to quiet fixes that look small and are not. Alan West said, to rules that serve courage. Claire Carter arrived with a cake that leaned like a brave building. She said, I am proud of the stubborn parts. Samuel Reed sent a one-line note. He wrote, onward. Ethan cut the cake and kept the first cracked slice. He said, we keep the reminder. The room glowed like a heartbeat instead of a siren. The night felt generous. The press wanted a villain to fall and a hero to rise, but reality preferred a ledger. Victor Hale said, market share is still mine. Ethan Carter replied, trust is not rented. Mason Cole appeared in a quiet article without triumph. The piece read, non-compete settled, apology private. Alan West said, accountability is not a headline, it is a practice. Priya Singh posted a guide titled, Proof Before Hype. Lucas Bennett said, publish the chaos tests weekly. Diana Park said, win by being boring in the right places. Oh. Claire Carter whispered, you look lighter. Ethan smiled and said, weight moves when it learns to stand. The company shipped a roadmap that favored clarity over fireworks. The roar of the world softened into the hum of work. Dawn climbed the skyline, and the roof felt like a page with room for more words. Ethan Carter said, I thought redemption would feel like thunder. Diana Park said, it often sounds like a steady light. Lucas Bennett said, we still have to earn tomorrow. Priya Singh said, then we will keep proving. Claire Carter took his hand and squeezed once, like punctuation. Samuel Reed texted, first audit of the round passes today. Nora Kim said, pipelines ready. Alan West said, contracts clear. Ethan looked at the city that had watched him fall and stand. He said, we were rejected, then tested, then chosen by the work. He turned toward the hatch and paused. He said, this is not the ending. He smiled and added, this is the standard. The sun answered without ceremony, and that was the point.